So hello, Fergus Bordewich. Nice to see you again.
Hello, Sharon. It's nice to see you as well.
Yeah, you are probably the defining historian for the Institute of Politics, Policy, and History with your great work about Washington, the making of the American capital, which really provides so much of the foundation for the story of what that we explore, and that is the evolution of the nation's capital, rediscovering it. Um, and so we're very grateful for all that you do. You've had about nine works, I think, non-fictional works as a historian. Um, and of course, we very much relied upon so much of what you provided us with that work in terms of the founding fathers of Washington, D.C., who are James Madison, who plays probably the most pivotal role, Thomas Jefferson, and then, of course, the man for whom this capital is named, who was very much encouraged all of that, bringing the capital to the South, and that was George Washington. And once again, we turn to you because we're looking at three outsized personalities who really played a larger than life role in moving us to becoming a meaningful venue. Because for we were sort of a backwater venue, and suddenly Washington D.C. got to be important, and that had so very much to do with the Civil War. So obviously, we deal with Abraham Lincoln, who prosecuted the Civil War and therefore needed a federal government that was, a more robust federal government. And then Frederick Douglass, who was probably the most noted, advocate, of course, William Lloyd Garrison and others, on terms of emancipation and therefore the influx of many formerly enslaved into Washington, D.C. And then finally, we talk about Ulysses S. Grant. And of course, everyone knows he is I guess, the sixth general who finally won the Civil War. But what we want to talk with you about, Fergus, which I think people really don't know, is how pivotal he was to Reconstruction. I mean, he really was pivotal. So, I mean, you're the author of the book about the KLAN War and how Ulysses S. Grant saved Reconstruction. Could you sort of, number one, tell us why it was you got intrigued enough to do the research to write the book?
Well, Thank you for that introduction, Sharon. And I think it's terrific to draw this kind of attention to Grant, who, as you said, has really, until quite recently, been overlooked. One as a significant president, but more particularly as a civil rights president, which he was. He was our first civil rights president. And without Ulysses Grant, it's possible that Reconstruction would have been undermined, even destroyed much earlier. Grant was fully committed to Reconstruction. But to come back to your actual question, uh, well, I had been writing at some length about the Civil War, uh, and I got to know Grant. I'll put it simply. I got to know Grant and to uh, recognize, of course, and also writing as I have about the history of slavery and the history of the genesis of civil rights legislation in the 19th century. It became clear that Grant was seriously overlooked, not only because he was a modest man who didn't seek to aggrandize himself, um, but also because Grant's presidency was largely airbrushed out of the American story by later historians, pro Southern historians, who not only airbrushed out Grant, but largely erased the history of African American soldiers in the Civil War, hundreds of thousands, plus, and diminished the history of anti slavery. And when you look clearly at the truth of this period and appreciate both the dynamism and the success of the abolitionist movement, uh, and early Reconstruction under Grant, you realize that Reconstruction was a triumph. It was not a failure. It wasn't riddled with terrible corruption. It didn't prematurely enfranchise African Americans. It was a success until it was destroyed politically. I should say undermined politically and then ultimately destroyed and erased. But if we look clearly at that history, Grant looms large.
Well, I think people really have to go back and reflect on what a tremendous shift that was in American thinking and in American practice, because Lincoln himself didn't enter the Civil War planning to abolish slavery. He ended, the fight was about not expanding slavery. And then, of course, he was determined that you couldn't just walk out of here whenever you choose and decide that you're going to just start your own nation. He was determined to preserve that union, but ultimately got to the point where he understood, with the encouragement of a lot of people, including including Frederick Douglass, that abolition had to be central to it. All that to say, I guess, could you say Reconstruction began when Lincoln put together that sort of ad hoc speech, which was what inspired John Wilkes Booth to assassinate him when he came out, was it the East Portico, and made remarks after everyone was so happy because there had been Appomattox. Was that, would you say, the beginning of Reconstruction when Lincoln made those remarks about how we figure out how we come together again? And he's also acknowledged there has to be a role for certain Black men, at least those who fought in the Civil War.
Say the Reconstruction, in effect, began well before that.
Okay.
Lincoln, in a sense, put a punctuation on something that was already happening as African Americans voted with their feet in the course of the war. Wherever Union armies appeared, enslaved people walked away from their workplaces by the hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands, wherever Union armies marched. And in fact, the greatest emancipation campaign ever was the Union recovery of the South for the nation. And hundreds of thousands of formerly enslaved people wound up in camps, sometimes in organized camps, sometimes in the very places where they'd been enslaved after their owners had fled. And the Union Army and its administrators were faced with the prospect of what to do with people. How were they going to be organized? And you have, in the course of the war, not to dwell too long on this, but in the course of the war, Union commanders, people who may not even have been that friendly to African Americans, frankly, but were dealing pragmatically with what they had on their hands, supported the creation of enclaves where African Americans lived freely, sometimes in a cooperative manner, tilling land that had once where they had once worked as slaves and now worked essentially as independent farmers and so on. And that's really the genesis of Reconstruction. And the federal government needs a policy for the freed people, who are going to number approximately 4 million.
Okay, but the real impetus for all of this was a very practical military interest. You would not allow your adversary, the South, to enjoy the assets of these enslaved people. Therefore, Benjamin Butler, who I think was not very sympathetic to African Americans, that I think was he? But he said it's contraband, so we get to take what they have and deny them that, and then you have to figure out what you're going to do with these individuals. Is that not something?
Yes, for sure. But I want to put in a word for Ben Butler here,
Okay.
who started out as a Democrat before the war from Massachusetts, but he was a radical. He was a radical Democrat, and he became a radical Republican. And by the post-war period, and was one of the most vigorous, articulate, and effective advocates, both for Reconstruction, for civil rights, and for African Americans. So he's somebody else whose reputation needs to be looked at again more clearly.
Okay, well, I certainly knew that he was the one who said this is contraband, and that was where it all, I think,
Yeah.
real impetus for getting it started. But it was still had to be a big debate about what you do with these folks, particularly since you've bought into a culture that suggests these are not individuals who could be function in our society. Lincoln himself said that. He said, you know, we're different people. I don't think that can work. And then to go from there to now saying, I'm going to start absorbing these individuals, certainly these men, into our system and considering them as citizens. That's a big leap.
Yeah, I think we also need to give a lot of credit to the radicals, the Republican radicals in Congress, people like Thaddeus Stevens, the paramount radical Republican who was also in effect the majority leader in the U.S. House of Representatives through the war, and many others, By the post-war period, these radicals, who are radical on behalf of civil rights, they're not radical in 21st century terms. In 19th century terms, they are radical because they espouse equal rights for African Americans and a hard war policy against the Confederacy. And they are men. They are all men, at least those in office, who are pushing hard against a more conservative Congress to create space for African Americans and are talking about citizenship even while the war is underway. Thaddeus Stevens, most eloquent of all. Charles Sumner, the senator from Massachusetts, being another one. So the idea of citizenship, the idea of creating space for former slaves to become citizens, to participate on an even plane with white Americans, and eventually to vote. That takes longer, but eventually to vote. These ideas are already there, and radicals in Congress are pushing them. And if I may, I'm going to turn this back to Grant for a moment, because one might ask, how does Grant become the first civil rights president? His father was an abolitionist, but Grant was pretty much non-political before the war. He was radicalized by the war, by encountering African Americans seeking his protection in the course of the war. And unlike some other Union officers, he welcomed fugitive slaves into his camps. He found work for them, he provided for them, and he felt a deep empathy. He was a man capable of great empathy, and he felt it for formerly enslaved people. And he came out of the war essentially as a budding radical. And by a few years later, in the 1860s, he has become a radical, although he doesn't really use the term about himself. But he's an ally of the radicals in Congress, and he becomes determined to enforce the 14th Amendment, which is the great watershed citizenship amendment. And he personally will go up to Capitol Hill and advocate for the 15th Amendment and franchising formerly enslaved people. So Grant is one of many, but the most important of many, who's evolving in the course of the war. And also, I should say, having witnessed the commitment and bravery of African American soldiers during the war. Unlike many Union officers, he embraced the recruitment of African Americans.
No, he really did. Yeah. And of course, without a doubt, I don't think any of it, I think that was a watershed moment, having African Americans who really were active in the Union Army, not just as support staff, but as actual soldiers. That really had a transformative effect, I gathered. But you think of it, all right, so now Lincoln gets it that you got to make emancipation central to this war. And even Lincoln gets it after these men are so valiant in the service of the country. And some say indispensable to that victory, 200,000 of them. Um, then you have Andrew Johnson come in. And I mean, unless you have these radical members of Congress like Thaddeus Stevens, I mean, Reconstruction or any notion of a Reconstruction is dead on arrival at that point, is it not?
Yeah, that's exactly right. Johnson, as we all know, was from Tennessee. He was a staunch Unionist during the war. He was the only Southern congressman to stay with the Union, and he served the Union well politically during the war. But frankly, he was a rock bottom racist. Uh, he owned slaves himself, whom he did free when it became politically expedient to free them.
Mm-hmm.
And he had no interest, just no interest in extending citizenship rights to African Americans. He supported emancipation. He opposed slavery as an institution. So he didn't try to stall the 13th Amendment. He
But
supported
he
it.
didn't like his, but didn't he didn't like that blue blood Southern crowd, right? Wasn't it part of that, that elitist crowd of the South, to the manor born, and he was not to the manor born. Wasn't that part of his resentment?
That's absolutely true. Certainly it was. Certainly it was. But he also came from a part of Tennessee which had basically was where the population was primarily white independent farmers, East
Mm-hmm.
Tennessee, and which was a Unionist area during the war. Uh, uh, he was typical of his time and place. But yeah, uh, he wanted to see the slave owning aristocracy cut down to size. On the other hand, when he became president after Lincoln's assassination, he looked around and he began cultivating political support from exactly that class because he saw that his only future as a politician to be elected president in his own right was with support from white Southern Democrats, and that is to say the slave owning class and their allies. So it's paradoxical and it's hypocritical, but that's kind of where Johnson
Well,
stood.
those are not unknown personality traits in politics. So we have basically the Republican Party. My impression is basically petition Ulysses S. Grant to become the nominee uh, because he was the one unifying personality that emerged from the Civil War. And so even though he wasn't naturally political, he was he was like Dwight Eisenhower was in the 50s. You know that you can win if you have this hero.
Yeah, that's certainly true. It's certainly true. Grant is not a natural politician, although serving as commander in chief of the U.S. armies during the latter part of the war and during Andrew Johnson's years, um, he learned a lot more about how to do politics, sort of inside politics, than he had known before. And he can be somewhat underrated, I think, as a politician. He was not natural. He didn't have a gift for it. Um, that was true, and it was a shortcoming he had even as president, 2 terms, but nonetheless. Uh, but he was a man of conviction. He was a man of real conviction. He and the radicals supported him because they understood that he was a man who morally and politically was committed to the goals that radicalism aspired to. And I want to say again, that's primarily the enfranchisement of formerly enslaved people and the democratization of the entire South, which was an oligarchic, aristocratic kind of system before the war based on slavery. And he was, Grant, small d, Democrat. He was a Democrat in his gut, which is to say, he had an instinct for common people, black or white. And he was also, I think it's important to say, in an era when even many people who were anti-slavery were certainly racist in today's terms and regarded African Americans as kind of a lower grade of human being. Grant did not. Grant had respect for African Americans. He welcomed African Americans into the White House. Doesn't sound like much today. It was a watershed at the time. He treated African Americans like people, like regular people. And so that he's a Republican politically, but when I say a small d Democrat, he understood the common humanity of everyone.
So I know, yeah, he wasn't a horse trader type of politician, but certainly he was a man of great moral fiber. And to what extent do you think the Republican Party really wanted to enforce Reconstruction? Do you think it was entirely also politically self-serving because they knew if it left to their own devices, and now as you allow these states back into the Union, lots of conditions, but left to their own devices, they're going to vote Democrat. They're not going to vote Republican. So you need Black votes, do you not, to win in certain portions of the South?
Yeah, that's all true, Sharon. Yeah, I mean, there's a moral dimension, which many Republicans, the radicals, did believe in, and many who were maybe not so radical, but really did understand that this was the way what history required and what principle required. People you today call sort of moderate Republicans. Then there were also conservative Republicans who, frankly, were not very happy with enforcing equality on behalf of African Americans. But across the board, radicals, moderates, and conservative Republicans, yes, as you just pointed out, so that that African Americans in the South, formerly enslaved people, once enfranchised, were a gigantic vote bank for the Republican Party. It's absolutely true.
And so in the wake of the 15th Amendment, because we have the 13th and the 14th and now the 15th, this is an important voting bloc. But is that the birth of the Ku Klux Klan? Is that when that happens?
A little earlier, but let me go back a couple of years here. The 15th Amendment enfranchises formerly enslaved people and all African Americans, frankly, including in the
men,
North.
Though.
Yes.
Right. Men I mean, because that's a real issue with what became the suffragettes, you know.
Absolutely. But Black men were enfranchised in the southern states several years earlier to vote in state elections. So Black men are voting in about 1867, 68, and demonstrate an extraordinary desire to participate in politics. It's quite revelatory, actually, if you look at history in the fine grain, that there were those in the North, white people, as well, Black people will never be intelligent enough or educated enough or this or that to be able to vote. Well, it turns out that people get educated very quickly. People are rushing to schools, adults, not only children, rushing to schools to become literate, to study politics, to join political organizations, and to participate, because formerly enslaved people are perfectly well aware of what rights are and what they've been deprived of and what it takes to participate. Vote. So from about 1867, 68 on, it's pretty obvious that there are a lot of Black votes that are going to for the Republican Party. And it's those votes that are sustaining the state Reconstruction governments across the former Confederate states. Those state governments are already in place. Most of them, not all, most of them are led, in fact, by radical state governments, thanks to Black voters, newly white Republicans. That's a whole other story. but whites are joining that same party. The Republican Party is initially biracial in the former Confederate States, which is very significant. Okay. The cooperation is broad and deep for several years. You mentioned the Klan. The Ku Klux Klan is developing. It's founded in 1860, late 66, but it becomes turbocharged, let's say, to use an anachronism, in the 1867, 68, 69, in reaction to the one, emancipation, two, Black individuals, men and women, asserting themselves, asserting their own dignity just in daily life, and in demanding proper pay for a day's work, that sort of thing, and participating in politics. Because people, I mean, when we think of politics, we mostly think of national politics, Senate, Congress, White House, and whatnot, but or governors. But government throughout rural America, and the South is rural America, the jobs that really matter to most people are the small jobs: town justices, constables, state legislators, county officers, this sort of thing. Thousands of African Americans, men, will be elected to those offices. So whites are having to deal not just with African Americans, men mostly, on an even plane in daily life, but in court, in the county office, and state government, because they're early being elected to state legislatures throughout the South, and many other public offices. So the Klan is a reaction to that tremendous dynamic increase in the participation of Black men, mostly, in public life. And the Klan has a couple of goals. I'll put it simply. One is to, as best it can, reimpose social relations in the South that are as close to slavery as they can, and two, to demolish the biracial alliance that is the Republican Party in the South, to draw a racial wedge between whites and blacks in the party. How do they do that? They kill people. They kill people. We're not talking about guys protesting with signs and such. We're talking about murder and torture and intimidation of Black Southerners who assert themselves, and particularly office holders. This is a guerrilla campaign that involves many tens of thousands of white Southerners against Black Southerners and white Republican Southerners.
And this started. What state does it start in one place? And what swath or slice of the population most likely to do it? Is it, I mean, I gather those professionals, those who felt displaced. Help us understand.
Well, the Klan starts in one place, yes, Pulaski, Tennessee, which was a large town about, I think, 75, 80 miles south of Nashville. It started out as a kind of funky fraternity rather than a terrorist organization, but it very rapidly was taken over by former Confederate officers who saw its terrorist potential for scaring Black people primarily. And within about a year, it's already engaged in systematically terrorizing people. And it spreads with terrifying, indeed, frightening speed across the South, the former Confederate States, almost everywhere. And it becomes essentially the paramilitary wing of the Democratic Party in most Southern states. That's to say, it's the normal party can deny it has any relation with the Ku Klux Klan, but in fact, they're often the same people. And your other question was, who joins the Klan? Well, it pretty much cuts across class lines. The leadership and many of the rank and file are actually from what you'd call today the middle class. They are somewhat more affluent farmers, former plantation owners, professional people, doctors, lawyers, journalists, um, ministers, members of state legislatures, office
Mhm.
holders, sheriffs, could be anybody. Many members, of course, are what you'd call, I guess, dirt farmers, independent farmers, or farmers who are dependent on wealthier people in the South. But that they're not really the driving force in the Klan, in the first Klan of this period. It's an organization that really represents the interests of people who feel they're losing, who are indeed really losing status and power
Yeah.
as a result of democracy, as a result of democratization in the South. That's what they are revolting against. There's the great pure racial development. They can't stand seeing Black people aspire to be equals. The other element is just anti-democratic.
So, I think it would be useful to really elaborate on what they did. I think it wasn't, they were, I mean, you say they killed people, there was a lot of lynchings. They mutilated people, didn't they? I mean, they burned down homes, etc.
Yeah, I mean, yes, they did. Anything you have read about in today's newspapers in our own era about terrorist organizations in other countries perpetrating against unarmed, hapless, and helpless civilians, the Ku Klux Klan was doing in the United States to other Americans, mostly by far Black Americans, but also to white Republicans too. Yes, lynching, by the way, didn't by any means just mean hanging, which it tends to. People assume today. It just meant killing. Most people who were lynched were in fact shot. Um, uh,
Hmm.
many, many were tortured. Yes, they perpetrated things I'm not even going to describe in our conversation here because they're pretty sickening. Mutilations of people, sexual torture, um, rapes as a political act, um, uh, unspeakable humiliation of men, women, and children, in front of their own families or in their communities. And the aim was, of course, to terrorize. I mean, you could terrorize without killing, but people were often terrorized and then killed also. Um, the exact number is not really knowable because many of these deaths were not actually recorded, but more than 2,000 have been documented, more than 2,000 over approximately a 5 to 6 year period. And the number of people who were threatened, intimidated, physically tortured, or harmed in one way or another is many multiples of that. But you have to imagine many of these things are taking place out in rural areas where the people disappear, if you know what I mean. Sad to say, they just disappear, or those who are perpetrating the crimes are also the ones who are kind of running the county.
Were any of the Confederate leaders involved? People like, I mean, Jefferson Davis, or someone of that caliber, were they involved with this?
Jefferson Davis, no. Robert E. Lee, no. Neither of them denounced
Yeah.
the Klan. They had an opportunity to denounce the Klan. They were invited to, and they didn't. Uh, Quite a few men who were high-ranking Confederate officers, some who were generals, uh, were Klan leaders. The one who, I wrote about at greatest length in my book, and who was the leading figurehead of the Klan for a number of years, was Nathan Bedford Forrest, a who was a war criminal. He led the massacre of a mostly Black Union garrison during the war in 1864, Fort Pillow, also massacred white troops, but the vast majority were black. So he was a war criminal. He was a pre-war slave trader, made a fortune trading in human beings. And he was invited to become the first wizard, grand wizard of the Klan. He wasn't the founder. Some people will often say he was the founder. He wasn't, but he was drafted pretty early on. Why? He was famous. He was charismatic. And he was as I implied in what I just said, a kind of take no prisoners sort of individual. And he was not, the Klan didn't have a public spokesman, but within the Klan and within the South that was friendly to the Klan, Nathan Bedford Forrest was known as the Grand Wizard. It was an office. It wasn't just something people said. He kept that office for a number of years, but the Klan of that era, it's important to realize, was actually very diffuse. It was very spread out. It wasn't as if Nathan Bedford Forrest was sitting in Nashville, Tennessee, directing everything. In point of fact, the Klan was highly decentralized, and it operated mostly on a kind of county by county basis. According to the same principles, they had a document, a kind of constitution that was very widely distributed, and groups could just sign on to it. And yeah, they all adopted these kind of crazy costumes that we imagine, because it worked. It was, you could, if you concealed yourself, the victims didn't know who was perpetrating the crimes. And it was, and this is essential really to the success of the Klan when it was successful, which is that men will do things, will commit acts, heinous acts, with other people, in a mob of other people, if nobody knows who anybody else is.
Yeah. So, I mean, forces had to be great for Ulysses S. Grant to take this on. The reason I say that is he may have been empathetic and sympathetic to the plight of African Americans, but this country has just gone through a civil war for 4 years, and it was a brutal, brutal war. And to actually take on a militaristic type fight again had to be a difficult decision. Can you sort of expound upon that for us?
Yes. Yeah, as I said a little while ago, the Klan was essentially running rampant from about 1868 to about 1870. Grant took office in 1869, okay, as president, and he's receiving letters by the hundreds and hundreds. You can read these in his collected papers. Very interesting, often quite tragic. People are writing to him, black people, white people, men, women, writing to him, describing what the Klan is perpetrating, begging for federal support. He's also getting the same kinds of reports from military officers in the South, federal officers who are in the South, from Republican governors and state legislators and so on. So he's very well informed about what's happening. There was the hope initially that each state would manage to get law and order, restore law and order. It wasn't happening. There is a myth that the South was under military occupation during Reconstruction. It is a myth. There were very, very few federal troops in the South. Something, it varied a little bit from year to year. About 3,000 spread all the way from Virginia to Texas, you know, and this is nothing over 11 states. It's nothing. There were very, very few federal troops. Why was that? Well, Andrew Johnson didn't really want to keep them there. So Grant inherited a very, very thin occupation force. It's also fair to say that Northern families wanted their sons to come home already.
Yeah,
now they've been in uniform, under arms for years. They wanted them home. So there was a pressure to shrink the army and to shrink the military budget, as there is after every war. Okay, so that's what the situation that Grant faced. To cut to the chase here, it also required federal legislation to use federal force against the Klan. Okay, why? Because until this point, the 14th Amendment, at any rate, the Bill of Rights was generally understood as a set of principles and laws that were to be enforced by the states within the states, not by the federal government. It's quite different today, but it's essential to understand this. Well, why didn't the federal government act? Well, legally, they really couldn't act very easily. I'm skipping some nuances here, but so Congress, led by the radicals in Congress, specifically Benjamin Butler, whom we talked about earlier, in the House of Representatives. Thaddeus Stevens sadly died in 1868. Butler kind of inherited his place at the forefront. At any rate, Congress crafted three, what they were called enforcement acts, laws designed to enforce the 14th Amendment in the South, to enforce the Bill of Rights, essentially, in the southern states, and specifically targeting the Ku Klux Klan because it was destroying, it was preventing citizens, mostly Black, but white Republicans as well, from putting their rights into action in the South by undermining elections, murdering candidates and office holders, and so on and so on. But at any rate, this is watershed legislation because it gave the federal government, specifically the president, the ability to act. Very, very radical legislation at the time, which ought to be better understood. So, among other things, Grant takes two courses of action. There's military action, which is to say he beefs up the number of federal troops in the South. He dispatches some very capable military men who are in support, who politically support Reconstruction and civil rights for African Americans, to some of the places most infested with the Ku Klux Klan, and they act. Those soldiers begin rounding them up and infiltrating the Klan, using civilian spies and so on. It's a great story, which I'm not going to digress into here, how they actually carry this about. And significantly, Grant also dispatches more cavalry to the South. Well, what difference does that make? Because primarily, most of the so-called occupation troops, these few thousand, were infantry. And if you think about it, it's not very easy for a guy on foot to catch a Klansman, on horseback. So cavalry were essential, just pragmatically, to actually catch Klansmen. Okay, that's the military side of it, and the military is very effective. Second is the prosecutorial side. He has a superb attorney general, a man named Amos Ackerman, from the state of Georgia, who's become a Republican after the war, but is completely committed to equal rights and the enforcement of the Ku Klux Klan acts. And he personally goes down to South Carolina, which is going to be the test case, upcountry South Carolina, and presides over the investigation of Klansmen who've been arrested. In South Carolina alone, thousands of Klansmen are arrested. The Army and its spies now newly encouraged local law enforcement are so effective that the Klan basically collapsed. It collapsed. Thousands and thousands of Klansmen were either arrested by force or came in and surrendered because they knew the game was up. The Klan was violent, it was cruel, it was menacing when it was facing civilians, when it was facing hapless and helpless civilians living in isolated cabins. Facing the U.S. cavalry with carbine rifles, it wasn't so brave at all. It collapsed in on itself. So the Klan was broken by 1873, thanks to Grant's determination to move against it. both militarily and juridically.
You say about 1873.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So it was a few years for him to pull this
Yeah.
off.
Took about 2 years.
Yeah, it was pretty intense. And you're fighting your fellow countrymen. So how much pushback did he get? I mean, did the Republicans stay with him on it? Or, you can be, oh, I'm going to win this war, but people will start bailing on you. Were they with him?
Well, Sharon, that is exactly the right question to ask. And you're politics. And so the war against the Klan was won in the field, but it was ultimately Reconstruction was defeated politically. Yes, there's pushback. Okay, even as the federal government is destroying the Klan, which it did, after several years of intimidation, one southern state government after another has been flipped by Democrats. Many Black voters have become afraid to vote. White Republicans have become afraid to vote, and this racist wedge has been driven between Black and white Republicans. So little by little, over a few years, Democrats are gaining control of the states. In 1874, in the by-elections, the congressional elections of 74, the Democrats, for the first time since the 1850s, won control of the House of Representatives. And I have to say, I regard that as really the practical end of Reconstruction. Because why did that really matter? Well, as you know, of course, it's the House of Representatives that controls the purse strings. Democrats in the House of Representatives would not finance the military occupation in the South any longer. And they would not finance the prosecution of Klansmen. Thousands had been arrested, but the government prosecutors, there were too few prosecutors because Congress wouldn't fund them. And the backlog of cases was so enormous that most never really got prosecuted. It didn't mean that the Klan revived. The Klan was done for that time. But Grant was hamstrung. And there were, by 74, or 76, the next presidential election, there were only 3 Southern governments still in the hands of Republicans. And all of those are hanging by a thread. Now, to give you another layer of the political dimension here, it was pretty obvious to Republican politicians in Washington that their hold on the southern states was slipping and slipping fast. So the national Republicans basically reoriented their strategy for winning national elections toward the Midwest and the far West. You'll notice, by the way, if you look at the list of dates of at which territories became states, an awful lot of those Western states became states really fast in that period. And they're all Republican at the beginning. And so the Republican Party's geographic orientation shifts. Yes, the Republican Party still exists in the South, but it's going to be an ever shrinking minority party, and primarily a Black party. Into the turn of the 20th century. It's only at the turn of the 20th century when really all African Americans, in practical terms, are disenfranchised. It takes 25 years. It didn't happen all at once in those former.
And of course, the compromise that was in 1877 took all federal troops out of the South. And that truly had to be, that was it. That was you're saying it was all over before that.
Yeah, the handwriting was on the wall in 1874. But what happened in the election of 1876, which was only resolved a couple of days before the inauguration date in 77, it was essentially a hung election.
Yeah.
We know about those now, don't we? But And the electoral votes of 3 states hung in the balance. Those are the 3 states that had nominal Republican state governments, but which were hanging by a thread, as I said a few minutes ago. And the outcome, it wasn't exactly a backroom deal. There was a process. The process was reasonable, institutionally reasonable.
Mm-hmm.
That it involved Democrats kind of yielding to Republicans by permitting the electoral votes of those 3 states to be counted for the Republican candidate, Rutherford B. Hayes. But the agreement was that the federal government would not actually pull troops out of the South. They were pretty much out already, but rather that the troops that were in the South would not prop up those state governments. They would, which they were doing. There were federal troops camped in the state house in Columbia, South Carolina, to keep a Republican governor who was in the process of being overthrown by a white Democratic coup. You think there have never been coups in America? It was a coup. Mm-hmm. And there were a couple in the South, another one in Mississippi, but we went during the same period. So rather, the Republicans tacitly acknowledged that the South was lost, that Republicans could not win these elections anymore, state elections, even though there were black congressmen still in office in some southern states as late as, I think, 1901. Much longer than people might imagine. But we're talking about one man here, one man there, 2 people there. The numbers are minuscule. So, but from 77 on, something else that happens that, and this has been happening actually since the late 60s, the Supreme Court, for reasons that I don't think we'll go into in this conversation, the Supreme Court has essentially been dismantling the federal enforcement policy in the South. The Supreme Court, in a series of decisions, has been ruling that the federal government does not have the authority to enforce the 14th Amendment in the South, that the 14th Amendment didn't mean that. Now, we in our lifetimes, beginning in the 1960s, saw a Supreme Court in a different era restore those powers, restore those rights. But the federal government was deprived of that power by the Supreme Court in the 60s, primarily in the 70s. So the federal government, the Republicans, even those ever diminishing in number, the radicals have been dying out. They were old men, many of them, and losing elections. There are fewer and fewer and fewer of them in Congress. And there are more and more, let's call them moderate or conservative Republicans who want to take on new issues. They don't want to deal with race. They don't want to deal with the South. They don't want to deal with rights anymore. They want to deal with other, the next generation's issues. And we see this kind of tragedy occur in politics many times over.
No, this has been a very timely and insightful conversation as we talk about American history, because you come to appreciate that someone like Grant, in an environment that was unduly turbulent. I mean, that was really a turbulent environment, a country that was truly torn apart. And he's a part and respected, I think, by the South because of his graciousness with Lee and Southerners at Appomattox, in terms of not just being harsh with them, but that he stayed faithful to a set of principles. And when it was not politically necessarily beneficial, and it was rapidly becoming anything but beneficial. So I guess there's a lesson to be learned from all of us here in the 21st century as we reflect upon him. And Fergus, we really are very indebted to you for bringing that history to life, and allowing us to really appreciate this extraordinary American hero. Many don't appreciate what an extraordinary hero he was. He wasn't the only general who delivered in the Civil War, but also a man who remained true to principles as President of the United States. So thank you very much, Fergus. This has just been a delight.
Entirely, and it's just I'm so pleased on Grant's behalf. He's not here to watch the to watch the show, but on his behalf, that he can be restored to our historical memory.
No, it's an important memory, and it's important for us to remember. There are those who stood by a set of principles